Welcome. Hi, I'm Robbie Feuerstein, Cowgirl Yarns Knit Doctor. This is the second in a series of virtual lessons that I'm teaching on what to do when you have some simple knitting mistakes. In today's lesson, we're going to cover what happens when you have knit your first stitch of your row as two, which is a common knitting mistake with new knitters. The second thing we'll cover is what happens when you have an accidental yarn over in the middle of your row and how to fix that. And the third thing we'll cover is something that causes a lot of panic among knitters of all abilities, and that's what happens when you drop all of your stitches off of your needle. So if everybody's ready, let's get started. So the first part of our lesson today is going to be looking at that first stitch of your row. Beginning knitters often misinterpret this stitch because it can look like actually that it is two stitches. With our yarn to the back, you can see, as if we were ready to begin our knitting, that this is our first stitch, and it looks like one. If after I've laid my knitting down and my yarn gets twisted, sometimes we'll pull it to the back thinking we're ready to begin our row, and that first stitch looks like two. If I knit those two stitches, or if I knit these two right here, it will actually add stitches to our row, making our count wrong for the number of cast-on stitches that we have completed. So if I put my yarn back to the back as if I'm ready to begin my stitch, my first stitch, this one right here is kind of the culprit that made it look like two. So make sure that when you are ready to begin your knitting, that you keep your yarn to the back, and when you finish your stitch, you're only knitting one and not two. Okay? You'll see that. And another thought regarding that is a lot of people confuse this stitch because it's loose and kind of floppy, but as you work the row, that stitch tightens up a little bit. So make sure that when you begin your row, your yarn is to the back. You only have one part of the stitch over your needle, and not confusing it by pulling your yarn over and stretching that stitch that's below. Okay? The next thing we're going to be talking about is what happens when you have a yarn over in the middle of your row. Well, what is a yarn over? So let me show you. I'm going to knit a few stitches. I knit the continental method preferably, and so you'll see me carry my yarn in my left hand. But I'm going to knit a few stitches, and I'm going to show you what a yarn over is. A yarn over actually is a common stitch in many patterns, but you don't want to add one where it's not supposed to be. So we're going to show you, this is a yarn over. It just goes over the top of your needle. It can actually look like a stitch, but can actually add another count to your row on your stitch count. So when you're knitting, you have this stitch right here that has no stitches below it. That's called a yarn over. And what happens is if you are knitting and inadvertently wrap that yarn over the tip of your needle, that can alter your stitch count. So when you're knitting, make sure that you complete your stitch all the way through by pulling your tip of your yarn all the way through the stitch and dropping it off the needle, rather than getting that wrap over the top. Okay? So make sure you complete your stitch, pull it through, and drop it off. I'll show using the continental method. Make sure you finish your stitch all the way around, all the way through, and drop it off. And avoid getting that yarn over on your needle so that you have the wrong stitch count. All right, it will also leave a hole in your knitting too, and you'll realize that. So what happens when I get a yarn over? How do I fix it? In our last lesson, we talked about how to unknit or untink. So I'm going to show you again, just as a little review. But if you give your yarn a tug and you notice there's this little hole underneath your stitch, if you put your needle in through there, drop it off again, and we're going to go back to that yarn over, which is this one. You see there's no stitch attached to it, it's just over my needle. We're going to drop it off, and we have fixed our mistake, and we can continue knitting. The final thing in our lesson today is going to be what happens when you drop all of your stitches off of your needle. So let me finish this row real quick, and I will show you what happens. This actually causes a great deal of panic for knitters, experienced and unexperienced alike. So I'm going to take all my stitches off my needle, and it causes a lot of panic, but it's very simple to take care of. So the first thing you want to do is, I always get a knitting needle that's smaller than the one I was using on my project. So I was using a bigger needle. This one's much smaller. So I'm going to be using the smaller needle to pick up my stitches. That makes it much easier. The second thing I'm going to do is lay my project out on a flat surface, whether it's a counter, a table, the floor, depending on the size of your project. But find a flat surface so it's nice and stable. You can lay it out, flatten it out, and it helps avoid some of those dropped stitches. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my smaller needle and I'm going to pick up my stitches one at a time, being very careful and very gentle that I don't tug on the stitches, because that can cause me to drop stitches that I will have to pick up later. And I'm going to be very gentle and very careful, and I'm going to slide all of those stitches onto my needle. Now, one thing I want to let you know is that we always are very careful about the direction of our stitches when we're knitting, but when you're working on those dropped stitches off of your needle, it's okay if you don't worry about the orientation of your stitches initially, because we can go back and fix those in our next step. So once you have picked up all of your stitches and they're on your needle, they're all secured, the next thing we can do is check for our stitch orientation to make sure that none of them got twisted when we were picking them up. So I'm going to look at my stitches. And in my last lesson, we talked about the directionality of our stitches, that they should be pointing from back to front. So if I look at my stitches, I'm going to look at them one at a time, and as I transfer them from my smaller needle to my bigger needle, I can notice and fix any of those twisted stitches that might have gotten twisted when we were picking them up. So I'm going to transfer them just by slipping them from one needle to the next. All of them seem so far, if you look, this one's pointed toward the tip of the needle, that one's correct. This one's correct. This one's correct. It looks like my stitches are all correct if I look at them all, but I want you to see what it looks like when they're twisted. So I'm going to turn a couple of these stitches around, and so that you can see what they look like when they are not the correct direction. I'm going to lay these down a little bit so you can see. If you notice that this stitch and this stitch are actually angling backwards, that means that when I picked them up, I didn't pick them up the correct direction, but they're easily fixed when I transfer them onto my regular needle that I'm using with my project. So what I'm going to do is use the tip of my needle, and I'm going to turn it around, and I can slip it. and turn that stitch. And if you notice, there it is, it's pointing toward the tip. It's in the correct orientation. I'm going to slip the rest of my stitches onto my regular needle that I was using in my project. And I have solved a major catastrophe, I guess you could call it, with knitting. So let's review those steps again. First of all, don't panic. Second of all, lay your knitting out on a flat surface. Third, get a smaller needle. That will help you pick up your stitches without tugging on them. The next thing would be to make sure that your stitches are in the correct orientation. But what happens if you have actually dropped one of those stitches in the process of picking them up? So I'm going to go back here and we're going to drop a stitch. And so you can see what happens, because this is very common. This is very common. When you have dropped all your stitches off of your needles, this happens very, very often. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the tip of my needle and as a crochet hook. And I'm going to pick up that dropped stitch. And I'm going one row at a time. You can use a crochet hook as well. And the last one. And then I'm going to set it back on my needle. Okay, that is a very common occurrence when you have lost all of your stitches off of your needle. So knowing how to pick up those drop stitches is a very important skill to practice and to learn. All right, thanks for joining. Thanks for joining me today. I hope that my videos have helped you solve some of those simple knitting problems. I'd be also glad to help you down at Cowgirl Yarn on Thursday afternoons from 4:30 until 6. Give the shop a call and make an appointment, and I'd be glad to help you out with some of those knitting problems and also to give you a few pointers. I look forward to seeing you. Have a good afternoon.